The air inside the courtroom felt heavier than stone. The great domed ceiling caught the glare of the overhead lights, casting long, unforgiving shadows across the packed gallery. Camera lenses glimmered in the distance, blinking like the eyes of restless predators. Jasmine Crockett stood at the center of it all, the solitary figure beneath that surgical spotlight. Her hands gripped the edges of a manila folder, so tightly the paper inside seemed to tremble with her pulse. She inhaled, deep and deliberate, and when she spoke, the tremor in her voice was not weakness, but contained fire. What you're about to hear changes history. The words landed like a gavel before the gavel. A murmur rippled through the room. Reporters leaned forward, pens hovering, every person suddenly aware of the moment's gravity. Her eyes did. Not waver dot in an instant, the scene fractured flashing images filling the mind's screen. The night blue backdrop of a 2019 news broadcast, grainy footage of Jeffrey Epstein being escorted in handcuffs through a Manhattan courthouse, headlines. Screaming of trafficking and conspiracy. A second montage rolled in. Donald Trump on a marbled patio in the 1990s, exchanging laughter with Epstein. The casual arm across a shoulder, the faint smirk under Florida sun. Still frames bled into another news cycle, Ghislaine Maxwell's. Conviction, court sketches, her name etched forever into infamy. Over it all came Jasmine's voice, disembodied, cold, precise. We have the receipts. The montage dissolved, and there she stood again, unblinking. Before her lay the documents, brittle-edged flight logs, creased guest lists, court filings in thick black binders, names and dates in neat ink. She did not need to read them aloud. The weight of their existence pressed into the space between heartbeats. We will show you the hidden ties, she said, her voice now the sound of steel dragging across stone. The timelines they never wanted you to see, and a truth that will stun. Each word was a step forward through history's most guarded corridors. Images flashed in quick cuts, a photograph of Trump boarding a sleek jet. A settlement record from a 1997 lawsuit, stamped and sealed. A press clip of him denying rumors with a smile too practiced to trust. The air in the courtroom thinned. Someone coughed in the back, a sound awkward and small against the stillness. Jasmine's gaze swept the room like a searchlight, locking on the judge's eyes just as the gavel struck once sharp. Miss Crockett, the judge said, voice firm but curious. You may proceed. Jasmine exhaled, a breath she'd been holding. For years. She adjusted the stack of papers in her hand, squaring them like a soldier readying their weapon. Outside the courthouse, the world was already leaning in. Inside, the silence had sharpened to a knife edge. The stage was set. The world held its breath, and Jasmine was ready to cut through the darkness. Asterisk, the murmur still lingered like smoke as Jasmine stepped forward, the courtroom lights pooling across the polished wood. She set her folder on the podium, fingers brushing over its surface as if to steady herself, not from fear, but from the weight of the truth inside. We begin, she said, her voice measured, with what is already on the public record. A screen behind her flickered to life, projecting photographs from the early 2000s. The first was an image from Mar-a-Lago, glasses raised, dresses glittering under chandeliers, the air thick with champagne and proximity to power. Jeffrey Epstein stood off to the side, his expression unreadable. A few feet away, Donald Trump laughed with another guest. The two men caught mid-conversation. This, Jasmine continued, is no conspiracy theory. These are images captured by the press, stored in public archives, untouched by speculation. She clicked to the next slide. A dated guest list from a Palm Beach gathering. Names in neat, typewritten lines. Epstein, Maxwell, Trump. She didn't raise her voice. The facts didn't need embellishment. Mr. Trump has said publicly that He wasn't a fan of Jeffrey Epstein. And yet, here he is, not once, but repeatedly, in the same circles. She moved to a document from a 2009 civil lawsuit in Palm Beach. She highlighted a section mentioning Epstein's social network high-profile individuals, many drawn to his wealth and influence. This is not an allegation of crime, she reminded the court, but of proximity, and proximity matters. The tension in the room grew tighter, coiling like wire. She leaned closer to the microphone, her voice lowering. Because when the same faces appear over years, across different cities, across private events, it ceases to be coincidence. The next slide showed a still from an NBC interview. Trump, leaning casually in a chair, smiling as he remarked, "I've known Jeff for 15 years. Terrific guy. It is even said he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side." The courtroom air chilled. Jasmine let the silence breathe before she spoke again. That was 2002. 17 years later, Epstein was arrested for sex trafficking minors. She turned back to the court, her gaze steady. When these associations first surfaced in the media, the response was denial minimization, but the record is not erased by a press release. It exists. It is archived. It is corroborated by multiple independent sources. A reporter's pen scratched furiously in the gallery. Someone shifted in the jury box, the wood creaking under their movement. "We are not here to debate what can't be proven," Jasmine said, "but to confront what can no longer be ignored." She closed the folder with a firm snap. "And next, we will examine the flight logs documents that tell us not just who was where, but when, the paper trail that speaks for itself." She stepped back. The judge's eyes followed her. The next chapter was waiting. Asterisk, the projector's light washed over the courtroom wall, casting grainy black and white text onto the surface like ghostly handwriting. Jasmine stood beside it, one hand resting on the edge of the podium, the other holding a single sheet of paper. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she let the names and dates sink into the room like slow-moving ink. "These," she began, "at last, are the flight logs from Jeffrey Epstein's private aircraft, made public through investigative reporting and unsealed court filings." Her tone was controlled, almost clinical, but her eyes carried the quiet heat of someone who had read and reread these pages in the dark hours of the night. "Every entry here," she said, gesturing toward the columns, "records a date, a route, and the passengers on board." A hush settled deeper as she moved to one particular entry, February 15th, 2002, the plane's tail number, the route from Palm Beach to Newark. Beside it, in neat block letters, Donald J. Trump. The room seemed to lean forward at once. Let the image hang there. No theatrics, only the stark gravity of black ink on yellowed paper. One appearance, she acknowledged, does not prove misconduct, but it does establish presence. And presence, especially in this orbit, is never without meaning. Flipping the page, she showed other names, some familiar from headlines, others from whispers. "These manifests," she continued, "also list political donors, corporate executives, and social figures who shared space with Epstein during these years." She turned her gaze briefly toward the defense table. "We've been told for decades that the most powerful men in America barely knew Jeffrey Epstein. But the logs are stubborn. They remember." The next slide came up an excerpt from a 2019 investigative article. Jasmine read aloud the journalist's words. "Flight logs are not a diary of guilt, but they are a map. And every map leads somewhere." A low rustle moved through the gallery. Someone cleared their throat. The tension was no longer theoretical. It was tied to paper and ink, to a tangible object sitting under courtroom light. Jasmine stepped closer to the jury box. "Understand this. These records survived because they were mundane at the time. No one thought they would matter. But years later, they have become testimony without a voice. Her fingers tightened slightly on the paper. And yet, even here, there are gaps, missing flights, unlisted passengers. That's the nature of shadows. But the entries we do have speak clearly enough. She slid the sheet back into the folder, her voice lowering to a final note. This is the first breadcrumb. And from here, we follow the trail, not just through the skies, but through the corridors of money and influence that kept Epstein untouchable for decades. She paused, letting the silence harden around her. Then, with a slow breath, she added, "Our next step, the money." The judge's gavel tapped once, not to interrupt, but to signal that the court and the nation was still listening. Asterisk. The air in the courtroom shifted as Jasmine replaced the flight logs with a new stack of papers thicker, heavier, bound with a red ribbon. She laid them on the podium like an offering, her fingertips brushing the embossed seals. "Flight logs tell us who was there," she said, her voice steady, "but money tells us why." The first document illuminated on the screen was a federal election commission filing. Neat lines, precise numbers, contributions from known Epstein associates to political action committees connected to Donald Trump's political orbit. Jasmine traced the figures with a laser pointer, the red dot pausing on each entry, as if branding it into the public's mind. "These are not hidden records," she continued. "They are available to anyone who looks. But for years, few have wanted to look closely enough." She flipped to a 2003 charity gala program. In elegant script, the sponsors were listed: Trump Organization, Epstein's Charitable Trust, a small but notable overlap. "No one is alleging a criminal exchange here," Jasmine said carefully. "But money does not move without motive. And shared ventures, whether philanthropic or personal, create ties that are not easily untangled." The next page was from a real estate transaction. A printout from the Palm Beach County Property Registry showed Epstein purchasing a home just a few miles from Mar-a-Lago. Jasmine let the coincidence hang in the air before speaking again. "Proximity is not proof," she said, "but it is opportunity." She moved to another slide, a 2002 photograph from a fundraiser. Trump and Epstein stood at opposite ends of a long table. In between them, donors and political influencers passed envelopes, shook hands, laughed at private jokes. Jasmine's voice dropped into a quieter register, the kind that forced the gallery to lean in. "You will hear the defense say these are coincidences. That charity events, donor dinners, and property records are the fabric of public life. And perhaps they are. But when the same names appear across flight logs, across guest lists, and across the flow of money, it is not fabric. It is a pattern." A man in the back row shifted uncomfortably. The creak of his chair seemed loud in the silence. Jasmine closed the binder with deliberate care. "In my years of public service, I've learned that influence leaves fingerprints. You may not see them in a single photograph or on a single check, but gather enough pages and the fingerprints become a handprint." She stepped away from the podium, pausing for a moment to let her gaze sweep over the jurors, the reporters, the cameras. "And that handprint," she said, "has been pressing on the scales of justice for far too long." Her eyes narrowed slightly, the signal that the tempo of her case was about to change. "We've examined the documents. Now we turn to the voices, those who saw, who heard, and who remember." The judge inclined his head. The next witness was already waiting outside the door. Asterisk. The room was quieter than it had been in hours, but the silence was anything but peaceful. It was the kind of stillness that follows the moment a truth is spoken, when everyone knows they've just crossed into dangerous territory. Jasmine Crockett sat at the long wooden committee table, her eyes fixed on the stack of files in front of her. She didn't shuffle them or fan them out. She just kept her hands folded, as though daring someone else to break the tension first dot across from her. Several Republican committee members avoided direct eye contact, staring instead at their notes, their phones, or the blank notepads they pretended to write on. The mention of Trump's alleged connection to Jeffrey Epstein was a conversational tripwire one. Everyone knew was there, but had spent years stepping around. "This isn't about gossip," Jasmine finally said, her voice cutting through the air. "It's about whether powerful men have been protected at the expense of justice for victims." Her words were deliberate, unshakable. A few seats away, Representative Whitaker leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, lips tightening. "And yet you conveniently bring this up right before an election season," he muttered, his voice just loud enough to carry. Jasmine turned her gaze toward him. "Justice doesn't run on the campaign calendar, Congressman. It runs on truth if we allow it to." Behind them, reporters typed furiously, some glancing up for reaction shots. They knew a story was forming, but it wasn't just about Trump or Epstein. It was about the network of enablers who had built careers out of keeping. Certain doors closed, and certain files sealed. Jasmine opened one folder and slid a single photo onto the table. It was grainy, but unmistakable, a fundraising gala photo. Trump and Epstein in conversation, laughing. The image itself wasn't new, but her voice was the blade that sharpened it. "This," she said, tapping the photo, "is not the crime, but it is a reminder. A reminder of who was given access, who was welcomed into the circles of power, and who benefited from silence." On the far side of the table, a committee aide shifted nervously, whispering something to his boss. Jasmine noticed. "You can whisper," she said, "or you can put it on the record. But we're not going to pretend this doesn't matter." The word record hung in the air like a threat. Everyone in the room understood that the official transcript was one thing, but the court of public opinion was another, and it was already buzzing. For a moment, it seemed as though no one would speak. Then a low, firm voice came from the other end of the table. Representative Morales, a Democrat from California. "The network is bigger than two men," he said. "If we pull at this thread, we'll see how deep it runs." Jasmine nodded, but her mind was already ahead, thinking about the witnesses who had been silenced, the files locked away, and the media deals struck to bury certain stories. This wasn't just about Trump's past. It was about a system designed to protect the powerful from accountability. And today, that system was on notice. Asterisk. The envelope was heavier than it looked. Its corners were frayed, the paper yellowed with time, as if it had been kept hidden in a place where no sunlight was meant to reach. Jasmine Crockett didn't open it immediately. She stared at it for a long moment, her fingertips grazing the faint, oily smudges left by someone else's nervous hands. When she finally slid her thumb under the flap, the sound of tearing paper echoed in her ears, like the ripping of a secret from history itself. Inside were photographs, some black and white, some faded Polaroids, others glossy prints from the early 2000s. The first one showed a younger Donald Trump, leaning against the ornate railing of a yacht, a glass of champagne in hand. His smile wasn't the rehearsed one from campaign rallies. It was sharper, private, almost predatory. Standing beside him was Jeffrey Epstein, one hand on the shoulder of a girl who could not have been more than 17. Jasmine's pulse quickened. She flipped to the next photo. This time, the background was a marbled foyer, chandeliers spilling golden light over the scene. Trump was there again, arm draped casually over Epstein's shoulder, both men in tuxedos, both grinning as if they had the world in their pocket. But it was the third photograph that made her freeze. This one was different, taken in some hidden corner, away from the glamour. A dimly lit room, red velvet curtains drawn tight. And there, in a corner of the frame, barely in focus, a figure who appeared to be restraining a young woman. The grainy quality made it difficult to see faces clearly, but Jasmine knew the significance wasn't in the clarity. It was in the context. She laid the photos out across the table, side by side, her eyes tracing the through line between them. This wasn't just socializing. It wasn't coincidence. It was proximity, access, repeated, deliberate presence. Her aide, Michael, leaned over her shoulder. These could blow the roof off the entire narrative they've built around him. They could do more than that, Jasmine murmured, her voice low, taut with restrained fury. They could prove he was in the room when it happened. Michael's breath caught. If this gets out, it's not about getting out, she cut in, turning to meet his gaze. It's about making sure the truth can't be buried again. But she knew the danger. These images didn't just threaten Trump's public image, they threatened the network that had shielded him. A network that had erased witnesses, silenced victims, and ensured that anyone who tried to pull back the curtain was either discredited or destroyed. She picked up the last photograph. Again, her eyes lingering on the blurred face in the shadows. Somewhere, she thought, there had to be an unedited original. Somewhere, there was a version where the truth was crystal clear. And if she could find it, then the world would see the night Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein stopped being untouchable. The moment Jasmine Crockett uttered her final sentence, the air in the courtroom thickened as if it had weight. Even the ceiling fans, lazily spinning above, seemed to slow in anticipation of what would come next. Onlookers, reporters, aides, legal observers sat frozen, their pens hovering just above their notepads, waiting. Trump leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed like a fortress. His eyes darted toward his attorneys, seeking the silent reassurance that everything was still under control. But they, too, were staring at Crockett, their confidence momentarily frayed. The presiding judge cleared his throat, his voice steady but edged with surprise. Congresswoman Crockett, are you implying there is additional evidence linking the defendant to? I'm not implying, Your Honor, Jasmine interrupted, her tone firm but respectful. I'm stating. A collective murmur rippled through the room. One court officer instinctively shifted his stance, as if bracing for the fallout. Crockett stepped closer to the evidence table, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She tapped a manila folder thick with printed emails, visitor logs, and phone records like a gavel. These documents, she said, corroborate patterns of contact between Mr. Trump and Jeffrey Epstein after 2008, after Epstein's conviction, after the world already knew exactly what he was. Gasps erupted from the press bench. The flash of camera shutters became a rapid-fire staccato, capturing the expressions of both shock and disbelief. One journalist whispered into his recorder, "This could be the turning point." Trump's attorney stood abruptly. "Objection. This is a political stunt." But Jasmine didn't even look at him. Instead, she directed her gaze toward the judge. "This isn't politics, Your Honor. This is about accountability. Powerful men have long believed their status grants them immunity from consequences. I'm here to remind this court that no one, no matter their title, wealth, or name, is above the law." The gallery applauded before the bailiff barked for order. The sound of the gavel cut through the noise, restoring an uneasy quiet. A moment, the only sound was the faint shuffle of papers as Crockett slid the folder toward the clerk. Trump's jaw tightened. Beneath the table, his knuckles whitened as he gripped the armrest, the image of a man accustomed to control, now feeling it slip. From the corner of the room, a young intern for one of the networks scribbled furiously. In her notepad, "This is history in the making." Crockett straightened, her voice lowering but carrying even more weight. "This is not about dredging up salacious headlines. This is about a pattern of choices, a pattern that speaks to character, judgment, and the safety of vulnerable people. And it's time this pattern faced the full light of the law." When she returned to her seat, The courtroom buzzed again. But something had shifted. The jury didn't look at Trump the same way anymore. And he knew it. Asterisk, the courtroom was a cathedral of tension. Every breath, every shuffle of paper, every creak of the bench carried the weight of consequence. The air seemed thicker now, charged with the electricity of what was about to unfold. Jasmine Crockett stood at the prosecution table, a pen poised in her hand like a conductor's baton, ready to orchestrate a symphony of truth. The judge's gavel struck once. "Proceed with your cross-examination, Miss Crockett." Jasmine rose, slowly, deliberately. Her eyes locked on the witness stand, where the defense's star witness Elon Musk's chief legal strategist sat, stiff and expectant. The man had been cool under direct questioning, reciting rehearsed lines like a seasoned actor. But now, under Jasmine's gaze, a bead of sweat betrayed him. "Mr. Harding," Jasmine began, her voice a silk thread woven with steel, "you testified. At all documents concerning SpaceX's government contracts were submitted on time and in full compliance with oversight requirements. Correct?" "Yes," Harding replied, his tone even. She took a step closer, the click of her heels echoing in the hush. "And you're certain there were no omissions? No withheld communications?" His eyes darted for the briefest moment toward Elon, who sat at the defense table with his arms crossed, his jaw clenched. "Correct," Harding said again, but his voice had lost a fraction of its earlier steadiness. Jasmine reached into her folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper, holding it between two fingers, as though it were an artifact of immense value. "Then perhaps you can explain this email dated 3 days before the deadline, where your office explicitly advises Mr. Musk to delay submission of certain financial records until after the oversight period." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The judge's gavel struck lightly. Harding leaned forward, squinting at the paper. I'd have to review the context." Jasmine stepped even closer, her voice tightening. "The context is clear. This isn't a clerical error. This is an instruction to conceal information from a federal oversight body, and you signed it." Harding shifted in his seat. His fingers gripped the wooden edge of the stand like it was the only thing keeping him from sliding into a pit. "I was following legal strategy." Jasmine pounced on the phrase. "Legal strategy, Mr. Harding? Or obstruction of justice?" The tension was unbearable now. Even the reporters in the back had stopped scribbling, frozen in the moment. Musk's expression darkened, his lips pressed into a razor-thin line. I wouldn't characterize it that way," Harding stammered. "No?" Jasmine said, tilting her head. "Then perhaps you'd like to explain why." She slapped another document onto the ledge before him. "This memo, sent to you from Mr. Musk himself, states, 'We can't let them see those numbers until after the vote.'" Harding's composure cracked. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. I need to speak to my counsel." Jasmine turned to the judge. No further questions for now. But in the gallery, the damage was done. The whispering had begun, and the tide had turned. Asterisk, the morning light filtered through the tall, narrow windows of the hearing room, casting long bars of gold and shadow across the polished wood. Reporters leaned forward in their seats, phones and recorders poised, sensing something monumental was about to unfold. Jasmine Crockett sat at the center of the committee table, her hands clasped loosely, but her posture radiated an unshakable readiness. Across from her, Elon Musk adjusted his tie and glanced at his counsel, his expression carefully neutral, almost too neutral, as if clinging to composure was its own exhausting effort. Chairwoman Velasquez banged the gavel once. "Mr. Musk, you are still under oath. Representative Crockett, you may proceed." Jasmine rose slowly, each movement deliberate. She didn't immediately speak, letting the silence settle like a heavy curtain over the room. The anticipation was a living thing now thick, electric. Then, in one swift motion, she held up a manila folder and let its contents fan out across the table. "Members of the committee," she began, her voice measured but resonant, "we have spent days discussing misuse of government resources, ethics violations, and the blurred lines between private influence and public policy. Today, those lines will be drawn clearly in black and white." One of the documents slid forward, catching the sunlight. It bore the unmistakable seal of the Department of Defense. A ripple went through the audience murmurs, shifting seats, the faint rustle of paper as reporters started jotting notes. Musk's attorney's jaw tightened. "These," Jasmine continued, "are internal emails obtained through lawful subpoena from senior executives within your company. They describe coordinated efforts to divert military-grade satellite technology for private contracts. They name dates, locations, and signatories. And Mr. Musk, they also include your name." The cameras zoomed in. Musk's lips parted slightly, not in shock. He was too disciplined for that, but in a calculation of his next move. Musk began. But Jasmine raised her hand. "You'll have your turn," she said, the steel in her tone unmistakable. For now, the American people deserved to hear the truth without interruption. A second folder emerged from her stack, this one bound in red. "This contains payment records, offshore accounts, tied directly to companies your team controls. Payments made within days of these satellite deployments. Payments routed through jurisdictions designed to hide their origin." Gasps rippled through the room, followed by a chorus of clicking shutters from the press pool. One reporter whispered, "This is it. This is the nail." Jasmine leaned in, her voice lowering just enough that the microphone still caught every word. "You stood before this committee and swore to tell the truth. But the truth doesn't bend to ego or empire. And today, the truth is standing right here." The tension broke like a taut string snapping. Members on both sides began speaking over one another, some calling for immediate recess, others demanding Musk respond on the spot. Chairwoman Velasquez's gavel thundered, but the room had already tipped into chaos. Through it all, Jasmine remained perfectly still, her gaze locked on Musk. For the first time, he looked away. Asterisk. The weight in the courtroom was palpable, not just in the air, but in the way every breath seemed to slow, as though the walls themselves were bracing for what was about to unfold. Jasmine Crockett had spent the morning dismantling Elon Musk's testimony piece by piece, each statement peeling away the layers of his carefully crafted public image. But now something shifted. This wasn't about incremental progress anymore. This was the moment that could redefine the entire hearing. Musk leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled as if trying to appear unshaken. Yet there was a twitch. In his jaw, a brief tightening of the muscles that betrayed the pressure he was under. His legal team exchanged hurried whispers, their eyes darting to him and back to their notes. Across from them, Jasmine straightened her posture, her eyes narrowing with the kind of focus that signals an opponent's last stand. "Mr. Musk," she began, her voice low and deliberate, "we've heard a lot about how this was simply a misunderstanding, a matter of interpretation." She paused, letting the silence linger until it became uncomfortable. "But what I have here," she said, lifting a thick folder, "isn't interpretation. It's fact." The rustle of paper as she opened the file seemed louder than it should have been. She pulled out a set of printed emails, the top one stamped with a familiar logo, not just Musk's company letterhead, but also an official government watermark. The gallery erupted in murmurs before the judge's gavel brought them to order. "These communications," Jasmine continued, "show your direct involvement in decisions that diverted taxpayer-funded resources to private ventures without the required authorization. They also show attempts to conceal these decisions by altering timestamps and omitting certain transactions from your company's compliance reports." Musk's composure cracked. His eyebrows drew together in a slight frown. and for a brief second, his gaze darted toward his lawyers. That tiny slip did not go unnoticed. "This isn't about ambition, Mr. Musk," Jasmine pressed. "This is about accountability. And no amount of innovation or vision gives you the right to break the law." The judge leaned forward, clearly aware this was no longer the slow grind of testimony, but the sharp, decisive thrust of a turning point. The jurors, though not the final arbiters here, exchanged glances that spoke volumes. By the time Jasmine stepped back, the tension had flipped. Musk was no longer in control of the room. The energy had shifted entirely in her favor. It was the kind of moment that didn't just alter the course of a case. It altered the trajectory of a reputation. The tension in the hearing room felt like a taut rope pulled to its breaking point. Every shuffle of paper, every muffled cough from the audience seemed to echo against the marble walls. Jasmine Crockett sat forward in her chair, eyes fixed on Tucker Carlson. He was no longer leaning back smugly. His fingers drummed nervously on the table, his gaze darting toward his counsel as if silently asking for a lifeline. Jasmine's voice, calm but edged with steel, sliced through the silence. "Mr. Carlson," she began, "over the past hours, we've heard your denials, your justifications, your convenient lapses in memory. But the truth has a way of cutting through all that noise. And today, the truth speaks for itself." She clicked her remote, and the large monitor flickered to life. The audience leaned in as a final video montage played, clips of Carlson's broadcasts, not just cherry-picked moments, but full sequences, each paired with leaked internal emails. The juxtaposition was damning. Carlson making fiery claims on air, followed immediately by his own private messages, mocking those very claims. "Our audience will believe anything if we frame it right." Jasmine read aloud from one email. Her tone was razor-sharp. "That's not commentary. That's exploitation. That's an intentional manipulation of the American people for profit." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Carlson's attorney objected, citing context, but the committee chair waved it off. "Proceed, Representative Crockett." Jasmine's eyes bore into Carlson's. "You sat in that seat today claiming to be a victim of bias. But you are not the victim. You are the architect of a machine built to sow division, distort facts, and erode trust in democracy. You didn't just mislead, you engineered a business model around it." Carlson shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. For the first time, the confident smirk was gone. Jasmine paused, letting the weight of her words hang in the air before delivering the coup de grace. "And here's the final piece." She clicked again. This time, the screen displayed financial records, payments from political action committees funneled discreetly into shell companies tied to Carlson's production team. The implication was undeniable. "This," she said, tapping the screen, "isn't journalism. This is corruption dressed up as patriotism." The room erupted in murmurs. Journalists scrambled to take notes, their phones lighting up with live updates to their editors. The committee chair raised a hand for order, but the impact was already cemented. Carlson tried to respond, but his voice cracked. This is taken out of context?" Jasmine interjected sharply. "No, Mr. Carlson, this is your context. You created it." Her words landed like a hammer blow. The chair finally called a recess, but everyone knew the damage was irreversible. Carlson's reputation had not just been challenged, it had been dismantled, piece by piece, in front of the nation. As Jasmine gathered her papers, she glanced once more at him, not with gloating, but with the resolve of someone who had fought for the truth and refused to flinch. The final blow had been struck. The courtroom's earlier clamor had dulled into a tense, brittle silence, the kind that makes every scrape of a chair, every rustle of paper sound like thunder. Jasmine Crockett sat poised at the plaintiff's table, her fingers lightly tapping a pen against her notes. Across the aisle, Elon Musk shifted in his seat, the glint in his eyes no longer one of arrogance, but of calculation. Judge Whittaker adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. Ms. Crockett, you've made serious allegations regarding Mr. Musk's misuse of government contracts. The court needs to hear your final substantiation before we move into deliberation. Jasmine stood slowly, each movement deliberate, as if the weight of the truth itself guided her motions. She took a step toward the center of the courtroom, her heels echoing against the marble floor. Your Honor, she began, voice steady. Over the course of this hearing, we've uncovered internal emails, whistleblower testimony, and public statements that form a pattern, a deliberate misuse of taxpayer resources. But patterns don't lie in documents alone. They reveal themselves in the culture a leader creates. She tapped the pen once on the lectern. And in Mr. Musk's culture, accountability is optional, if it exists at all. A low murmur rippled through the audience. Musk's attorney rose. Objection, Your Honor. Speculation on culture is irrelevant, sustained in part. Judge Whittaker said, but I'll allow her to finish if she ties it to evidence. Jasmine inclined her head. Gladly. She clicked a remote, and a screen lit up behind her, displaying a spreadsheet of contract changes, some marked in. Red. These, she said, pointing to the red entries, are modifications to federal transportation projects. Notice how each amendment coincides with a direct communication from Mr. Musk's personal office, often after hours, often without the oversight required by law. In one case, a project's cost doubled in a single week, justified by what? Was labeled urgent technical redesign. She turned back to the jury. Except the redesign wasn't technical at all. It was the addition of private, non-government features, a personal vanity project funded by you, the taxpayers. The jury leaned in. Musk's expression hardened, but he said nothing. Jasmine stepped closer to them, lowering her voice. This isn't about politics. It's not about ideology. It's about a truth we keep ignoring. Power without transparency will always become self-serving. For a moment, the air hung heavy with the unspoken. The juror's eyes flicked from Jasmine to Musk, to the glowing evidence behind her. Musk finally broke his silence. You think you've exposed me, he said, his tone low and sharp. But all you've done is make enemies you can't fight. Jasmine didn't flinch. Maybe, but at least my enemies will be made in the daylight. A hush settled. Judge Whittaker leaned back in his chair, scribbling a note. The gavel had not yet fallen, but everyone in that room understood. The tide had shifted. The courtroom felt unusually heavy that morning, as if the air itself had decided to cling to every surface, refusing to let go. Even the distant hum of the ceiling fan seemed muted, swallowed by the anticipation vibrating through the space. Every seat in the gallery was filled with reporters, hunched over their notepads, photographers ready to fire their shutters, and political aides standing at the back, eyes darting nervously toward the front. Judge Meredith Kline entered, her black ROB is flowing like a storm cloud. The gavel came down once sharp, decisive, cutting through the tension like a blade. Court is now in session, she announced, her voice steady, yet brimming with awareness of what was about to unfold. Jasmine Crockett sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture poised, but electric with quiet fire. Across from her, Elon Musk leaned back in his chair, exuding a brand of self-assured calm that felt more like defiance than confidence. His attorney shuffled papers, trying to look busy, but his eyes betrayed concern that the first witness was called a former Tesla whistleblower. As he approached the stand, a ripple of murmurs ran through the gallery. He looked tense, but there was a clarity in his eyes that hinted at the gravity of what he was about to say. Jasmine stood, her voice cutting clean through the room. Sir, in your time at Tesla, Did you ever witness the use of government-subsidized materials for personal, non-company projects? The witness swallowed hard. Yes, I did, multiple times. A hush fell over the courtroom. Jasmine didn't move, didn't even blink. Can you specify what these projects were? They involved prototype work for private space ventures and personal assets, not publicly declared to investors or government regulators. Elon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It wasn't a full expression, more like a microsecond flash of irritation before he returned to his poker face. Jasmine stepped closer to the jury, locking eyes with them one by one. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not just a matter of corporate strategy. This is about the diversion of resources funded by taxpayers, resources meant for innovation, and infrastructure being funneled into projects meant to serve one man's ambitions. She let the silence after that statement stretch, letting the weight of her words settle over the jury. Musk's lawyer rose, objecting to the emotional framing, but Judge Klein's gavel rapped once. Overruled. Proceed. The next 30 minutes were a cascade of documents, emails, memos, and budget reports projected on the courtroom's large display screens. Each one carried timestamps, signatures, and subtle but undeniable proof. The jury's faces shifted, from mild interest to something sharper focused, almost grim-dot. By the time Jasmine returned to her seat, the air felt different, lighter for some, heavier for others. The reporters were already scribbling furiously, sensing the shift in momentum. Elon glanced toward his lawyer, but there was no reassurance in his eyes. Now only the cold realization that the tide might finally be turning. And somewhere in that quiet, the courtroom collectively understood. The earthquake had started, and there was no stopping what was coming next. Asterisk, the courtroom had grown still, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes every heartbeat feel audible. Cameras hovered like birds in the rafters, reporters poised to capture the moment that would dominate every news cycle. Jasmine Crockett sat at the plaintiff's table, a single file folder in front of her, the culmination of weeks of painstaking research and relentless questioning. Across the room, Elon Musk and his counsel sat rigid, their earlier confidence now tempered by the weight of exposure. Judge Meredith Klein adjusted her robe and cleared her throat. Members of the jury, the evidence has been presented, the testimony heard, and the arguments made. You will now deliberate and deliver your verdict. As the jury filed into the deliberation room, Jasmine allowed herself a brief exhale. The tension had not left her, but there was a quiet certainty in her posture, a knowledge that the painstaking work of documentation, witness testimony, and moral persistence had placed the truth squarely before the court. Minutes stretched like hours. Outside, reporters whispered in anticipation, while inside the courthouse, Musk's legal team huddled, reviewing notes and strategies. Yet even as they conferred, the damage was done. Patterns of influence, emails, financial records, and whistleblower accounts had all coalesced into a narrative that was inescapable. Finally, the jury returned. The room collectively held its breath as the foreperson rose, clutching the verdict. Judge Klein's gavel echoed once more. Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict? Yes, Your Honor, the foreperson replied, voice steady, but heavy with the gravity of responsibility. Jasmine leaned slightly forward, her eyes narrowing as the words were about to land. We find that the defendant, Elon Musk, engaged in deliberate misuse of government resources for personal and private ventures, and that these actions were knowingly concealed from oversight authorities. The words hung in the room like a thunderclap. Gasps, whispers, and the flash of cameras filled the gallery. Musk's face was an unreadable mask, but his fingers drummed nervously against the table, one hand betraying tension that his public persona had never allowed to show. Judge Klein struck the gavel again. This court will now proceed with the determination of sanctions and recommendations for accountability. Jasmine allowed herself a measured smile. Not one of triumph, but of resolve. This was the culmination of weeks spent in relentless pursuit of the truth, of confronting power without flinching, and of insisting that accountability was not optional, even for those at the very top. Outside, the media storm had erupted. Headlines were already forming. Crockett holds powerful to account. Elon Musk exposed in landmark oversight hearing. Social media lit up with the verdict, each post echoing the shock, relief, and moral weight of what had just transpired. Jasmine gathered her documents, standing slowly as the courtroom emptied. Reporters swarmed, but she walked steadily, unbowed. Today, the truth had prevailed. And while the world outside debated and dissected every moment, one fact remained immutable. Accountability had been served, the powerful confronted, and history witnessed the unflinching courage of one congresswoman who refused to look away. The gavel's echo lingered long after the room emptied, a reminder that justice, though slow, could not be silenced. The courtroom was empty now, its polished wood reflecting the dim afternoon sunlight like a solemn witness to everything that had occurred. Jasmine Crockett gathered her files with calm precision, her posture unshaken despite the storm she had just orchestrated. Outside, the city buzzed with the fallout news vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, reporters debating every nuance of the verdict. Social media erupted with clips from the hearing, hashtags trending globally, conversations igniting across continents. In a quiet corner, victims' advocates quietly celebrated. The hearing had done more than expose the misconduct of a single high-profile individual. It had signaled a shift, a powerful statement that no one, regardless of wealth, fame, or influence, was beyond scrutiny. Jasmine's work had turned private concealments into public accountability. Her phone buzzed repeatedly. Messages from colleagues, journalists, and even some skeptical political observers acknowledging the courage and meticulous research that had driven the case. Yet she didn't check them. Not yet. She allowed herself a moment to absorb the gravity of the day, the years of digging through public records, piecing together flight logs, emails, and financial statements, confronting witnesses, and holding the most powerful to account. Every tense exchange, every cross-examination, every flash of judgment in the courtroom had led to this undeniable truth. Justice, though slow, had a voice. Jasmine stepped outside. The sun had begun to dip, casting long shadows along the steps of the courthouse. Protesters and supporters mingled in a tense harmony, their chants, cheers, and slogans overlapping in a strange symphony of democracy in action. Cameras zoomed in on her as she descended the steps, but she walked with quiet authority, unshaken by the lens, the microphones, the flashing lights. She paused at the edge of the crowd, taking a deep breath, allowing herself to reflect on what this day represented, not just for the high-profile figures exposed, but for the system itself. The hearing had illuminated the cracks in power structures, the manipulation and concealment that had gone unchallenged for decades. And now, the ripple of consequences had begun. Jasmine's assistant finally caught up to her, whispering, "The press wants a statement." She smiled faintly, shaking her head. "The statement has already been made. It's called the truth." As she walked away, the courthouse behind her seemed to exhale a monumental chamber that had held centuries of power, secrecy, and precedent, now silently acknowledging that one person's relentless pursuit could pierce through the shadows. The world had witnessed courage, diligence, and moral clarity. And though tomorrow would bring more debate, more scrutiny, and inevitable backlash, Jasmine Crockett had proven one enduring fact, that in the face of concentrated power, accountability could prevail, and the light of truth would always find a way to shine. Weeks had passed since the courtroom verdict, but the reverberations were still felt across media outlets, political circles, and corporate boardrooms. Headlines screamed, social feeds erupted with debates, and public discourse pivoted around accountability, power, and the mechanisms that allowed influence to escape oversight. Yet, for Jasmine Crockett, the storm outside was only a fraction of the significance of her work. She sat in her office, walls lined with books and framed articles, chronicling decades of political battles. On her desk lay the thick folders that had once been her arsenal in court flight logs, emails, financial statements. Now, they were artifacts of proof, meticulously organized, a record of the truth she had fought to surface. The weight of responsibility still lingered, heavier than any media spotlight or political accolade, because the fight for justice never truly ended. Her phone buzzed continuously, journalists requesting interviews, advocacy groups seeking guidance, colleagues reporting back on legislative initiatives sparked by her revelations. Yet she remained grounded, knowing the impact wasn't in the applause, but in the changes set into motion: internal audits in corporations, new oversight committees, and renewed scrutiny of government contracts. Outside her window, the city moved. With indifferent momentum, life went on. Yet the public discourse had shifted. Conversations that had once skirted around accountability now confronted it directly. Citizens debated, legislators proposed reforms, and even industry insiders began quietly adjusting policies to avoid similar exposure. Jasmine reflected on the broader picture. The courtroom had been the stage, but the real work was ongoing: education, advocacy, and ensuring that transparency didn't remain a fleeting spectacle. She remembered the faces of whistleblowers, the quiet courage required to speak out, and the meticulous research necessary to connect dots that powerful entities hoped would stay hidden. Each piece of evidence, each carefully crafted argument, had been a tribute to those who could not fight openly. Her assistant approached, holding a stack of new reports. "More follow-ups, Congresswoman," he said. She smiled faintly. "Good. Let them see that accountability isn't just a moment, it's a movement." Stepping out onto the balcony, Jasmine surveyed the city skyline, golden light spilling across the horizon. In that moment, she allowed herself a rare exhale, a small acknowledgement of victory. Not a personal victory, not one of fame, but a moral victory, a reminder that the mechanisms of truth, diligence, and courage could prevail even in the shadow of immense power. And as the sun dipped further, casting long shadows over the streets, Jasmine Crockett knew one thing clearly: the fight for justice was never over. But she had proven that when the truth is pursued relentlessly, it can no longer be silenced. Months had passed since the verdict, but its echoes lingered like a persistent hum across the political and corporate landscape. Jasmine Crockett's name had become synonymous with relentless pursuit of truth and accountability. Interviews, op-eds, and analysis pieces dissected her every argument, her meticulous preparation, and the moral clarity that had carried her. Through weeks of high-stakes confrontation. In Washington, legislation inspired by the revelations began to take shape. Oversight committees strengthened reporting requirements, transparency initiatives were launched, and whistleblower protections expanded. Corporations reviewed internal compliance protocols with unprecedented scrutiny. Jasmine's courtroom battle had not only exposed wrongdoing, but ignited structural change. She attended hearings and panel discussions, often listening more than speaking, watching the machinery of accountability evolve from within. Yet she never rested on past victories. The fight was ongoing. Each question posed by reporters, each advocacy group reaching out for guidance, reminded her that power was always evolving, always finding new ways to evade scrutiny. The public, too, had shifted. Social media conversations now included debates on corporate responsibility, political ethics, and government oversight. Citizens who had previously felt distant from institutional power began engaging with the processes Jasmine had fought to illuminate. Awareness, she realized, was the first step toward change. In quieter moments, she reflected on the human element, the whistleblowers who risked careers, the team of researchers who pored over mountains of documents, and even the courtroom staff who ensured procedural integrity under immense pressure. Their collective courage had transformed the abstract pursuit of justice into tangible outcomes, and Jasmine's leadership had been the catalyst. One evening, standing on the steps of the Capitol, she watched the city lights shimmer over the Potomac. Journalists crowded nearby, eager for sound bites, but she remained composed. Accountability, she knew, was a long game, not a momentary spectacle. Her work had revealed the hidden, forced reflection on the powerful, and sparked conversations that would ripple through institutions for years to come. Congresswoman Crockett, a reporter called, "What does this mean for the future?" Jasmine paused, choosing her words with care. "It means that no one is untouchable, that the systems we rely on can be improved, and that those who wield power have a responsibility that extends far beyond themselves." As she walked away from the Capitol steps, her silhouette framed against the glowing city, she carried a quiet conviction. The courtroom had been the battlefield, but the world outside was where the legacy would endure. Truth, diligence, and moral courage could change not just headlines, but structures, policies, and hearts. And in that certainty, Jasmine Crockett knew her fight was far from over, but the mark she had left on history was indelible.